So in listening to the tapes, or not the tapes, the video, it struck me that in some sense we had lost the context of the Olivet Discourse, and and so we were sort of struggling to understand. So rather than simply review those two verses, I thought we should do a much more extensive review. But before that, there were a couple of comments that I wanted to make about 2 weeks ago when I thought that I had not done a very good job of explaining or you know thinking for that matter. So one of the things that I was talking about was the emphasis on the second coming often leading to sin. When we think the Lord is coming or the end times are here. And incidentally, in traditionally in Christianity, the end times are dated from the resurrection. So we're living in the end times. The entire church age is the end times. And so the end times doesn't mean that Jesus is coming. The end times means that this is the end times. It's been the end times for 2,000 years. It perhaps will be the end times for the next 20,000, but it's the end times. So, in terms of it being sinful to focus on Jesus coming and to think we know something about Jesus coming, there were two things that had really struck me. The first is, for premillennial dispensationalists, there's this view that the temple has to be rebuilt in order for Jesus to come so that he reigns from the temple for 1,000 years. That's has been pronounced heresy in Catholicism. And so the first of all, I know Catholics who contributed money to the rebuilding of the temple. And second, there was a friend of mine, sort of a casual friend. So kind of to summarize a story, he was caught in an adulterous relationship, and he and his wife went to uh, marital counseling, and in marital counseling, it came out that he had been having an affair about every 2 years. They'd been married like 25 or 30 years. And in fact, he lost count of the number of affairs he had. So she left him, and he was irate because, divorce is not permissible and she's his wife, and he quoted Paul extensively. So he went off the deep end about the whole thing and got into prayer, supposedly, and talking to God. So God was talking to him about the end times, right? And he had notebooks filled with, he didn't show them to me, and I really didn't want to see them because, the communication is clearly from Satan, not from God. So in any case, I don't know whether he actually did it, but he was preparing to go to the Holy Land to join a group activist group focused on the rebuilding of the temple. So, that's kind of wacky. Then recently I listened to a very disturbing video. It was interviews with uh, young women, in their 20s to mid 30s, who had irreparably estranged relationships with their parents. And the basic estrangement came from the fact that their parents had all accepted QAnon. And what was common about all of their parents is one, they were Christian, And two, they believed that we were in, the end times, this, and that the coming of Christ was imminent. So one of the sets of parents had, stockpiled 8 months worth of food in their freezer. Although in any disaster, the electricity is likely to go out, right? So it's 8 months worth of food spoiled. And they had
Barbecue.
barbecue, but it's tough to barbecue 8 months worth of food and hope to keep it in good.
Bring the whole neighborhood over. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what happened the year before we moved in when, there was that long power shortage.
Yeah.
And then they had also amassed a huge stockpile of weapons, to prepare for the second coming. So, so this belief that Christ is coming and that we know is um, dangerous and ungodly, unchristian, and it's not something we can, you know, should be doing. And then also, at the in the second part of the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." When we decide that we know that Christ is coming, what we're really saying is that we are superior to Jesus, right? Because we know the hour or the day. So that's an act of idolatry. It's an act of blasphemy. So this stuff is serious. Um, I also, in listening to the video 2 weeks ago, I also I think didn't make it clear how painful the transition was from Temple Judaism to Christianity. We have 2,000 years of Christianity behind us, and so for us, Christianity or some of the basic tenets of Christianity are kind of obvious. So last week there was an emphasis on the resurrection, which I tried to sort of play down. But the thing is, I mean, as Christians, we know we believe that Christ was resurrected, but there's no proof. We can barely prove that Jesus existed, much less that he was resurrected. We know that not only he existed, but that he was also resurrected, but that's not obvious. So, so, so the question then becomes, what is the very public event that makes it obvious, or that confirms Jesus? And so, going back to that theme of covenantal transition, the decline of Temple Judaism. I mean, given that in the early period of the church, most Christians were Jewish Christians. Many continued to observe the Mosaic law. Many continued to revere the temple. And, they saw themselves as a sect, admittedly, unfortunately, often a persecuted sect, but a sect within Judaism that represented, the best of Judaism, or, the true teachings of Judaism. And so, you know, the the departure from that and the end of Temple Judaism is inconceivable. It's very, very difficult to fathom. Um, so, that covenantal transition is difficult. Um, and then the final thing, which I think I sort of stressed, but probably not enough, is that um, there's supernatural intervention involved in uh, the transition. And so I explained that really as God withdrawing his blessing. So when God withdraws his blessing, we become the, well, when God withdraws his blessing, there's no boundary and no limitation on the evil that we're able to commit, and no limitation on the degree to which we're able to deceive ourselves. So each of the sects in Jerusalem that were busy destroying one another's food supplies and eating one another, each of them believed that they were the true representatives of Judaism. Many believed that, the Messiah was in their midst, their sect. And yet, in the midst of all of this, they were committing, these grotesquely evil, barbaric acts. So much so that General Titus took no credit for the conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. He saw it as being largely done internally.
So as far as proof, I think just the mere fact that, number one, he was only known for doing healings and for being doing good to people. He had 12 people, 12 men that followed him.
Oh, remember,
each one gave their lives for him.
Right, but remember, you're drawing all of this largely from the Gospels.
Right.
And so, if the Gospels are fake.
But the Gospels don't really tell you how everybody died.
No, the church tradition does, but then again,
there's a lot of.
But then again, the question is, how do we know that that's not fake? Especially, since some of it is not well recorded, is not documented particularly well, and is sort of legendary. Well, what I'm really, sort of saying here is that first of, I mean, there are several things. First, that the destruction of the temple is a graphic, is first of all, it's indisputable. We can argue whether Jesus was resurrected. We even conceivably can argue whether Jesus existed in the first place, although, there's sufficient documentation from non-Christian sources, particularly Josephus and Livy.
Mm-hmm.
But but we can't argue that the temple didn't exist and has now continued to not exist. The temple once existed and was destroyed in AD 70. That's indisputable. Then, the question is, I mean, the fact that it was destroyed then lends credence to a prophecy of the temple's destruction. I mean, one can argue that Matthew's gospel was written after the destruction of the temple. But the basic, sort of problem with that is that so we see, first of all, we see the Olivet Discourse or some sort of prophecy in the end of the end in all synoptic gospels, but we don't see it in St. John's gospel. Right? There's nothing like that. There is a rough correspondence. It's Jesus' high priestly prayer, which is really a very different thing. It doesn't relate to the second coming at all. So the question is, why might that be? And the most likely answer is that John's gospel was written so late that the temple didn't exist, and everybody knew that the temple didn't exist, and everybody knew that temple Judaism was dead, and that there had occurred a covenantal transition. And so then we go back to the destruction or the cleansing of the temple in the Synoptic Gospels versus John. They all have it late. It comes at a period when Jesus' conflict with the religious establishment has become irreconcilable. And so he then makes a prophetic statement. The basic underlying theology is the same. It's that Jesus replaces the temple, but in the Synoptic Gospels, that conclusion emerges, if you will, through a process of conflict and struggle. For John, there's no need for the conflict and struggle because it's already happened. And so he begins with the cleansing of the temple because Jesus is the temple and there is no temple anymore. So, so then, it's been argued that Matthew was also written after the destruction of the temple, but that, and especially in, sort of terms of modern scholarship, there's been, all of this emphasis on Matthew including all of this stuff in his gospel that reflects the situation and the context of his own community in Antioch. But that's absolutely, completely conjectural. And, if we were to, we've talked about kind of the exceptionalism of Bible interpretation, that because it's a matter of faith, you are, sort of given uh, an exemption from, the rules of solid evidence and solid logic. And then what's done with that exemption is that faith is attacked. So here we have, this invention of the conditions in the community in Antioch about which we know little, and an assumption that Matthew is writing about the conditions of his community in Antioch, which is purely conjectural, when based on the internal evidence of the gospel itself, everything points to it being written before 70. Right, so that means that, and so in some form, Matthew is recording the, a discourse that Jesus presented. He's almost certainly perhaps embellished it or added some words, but we have to assume that it's more or less faithful to Jesus' content, Jesus' actual discourse. And so it becomes a prophetic statement about the destruction of the temple, which is to say that before the temple was destroyed, Jesus saw this cataclysmic event. And again, we can't imagine, how cataclysmic it was. When Jesus says that, there will never be suffering of this kind again, he means that because from the viewpoint of Judaism and from the viewpoint of salvation history, the world has been ended. God has once again destroyed his people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's involves, great suffering. So is that at all clear? So let's let's sort of go through and try to weave together uh, Matthew's gospel, taking us hopefully up to the point that we've gotten. And so one of the problems, I mean, we, on the one hand, we're accustomed to looking at Matthew's gospel in sections. And then in the Bible study, we've gone very carefully verse by verse. And in some ways, I think, although I constantly try to point to how is this related to, the previous verses in the gospel, and we're accustomed to sort of pigeonhole parts of the gospel. But remember that when it's only under the scholastics that the Bible was divided into chapters and only later into verses. So, and also we've come to see the Gospels as sort of these, and the Bible as a whole for that matter, as these collections of stories. So Jesus heals the leper. Gee, that's a great story. Jesus presents the Sermon on the Mount. Oh, nice story. I like it. Jesus heals the blind man. Great story. Go, Jesus. But that's not. But that's not what it's about. That's that we lose the entire point and the entire meaning. Matthew's gospel is an integrated whole. Each of the gospels is an integrated whole. All of the writings in everything in both the Old and the New Testament is an integrated whole, and we often lose that integration. So we'll go quickly through sort of the early part, but let's start at chapter 16, verse 1.
Chapter 16.
Chapter 16. This is really critically important if we look back at it. I'll read it quickly, and then I'll comment as we go along. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign shall be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So he left them and departed. Not a good sign when he leaves and departs. So they're asking for a sign, and they want a cosmic sign. So remember, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is talking about all of these cosmic signs. That suggests that those cosmic signs that he's talking about aren't real, they're symbols, right? And then he says, no sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And the reason for that is that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, and then was spewed out. And so that's a prophetic foretaste of the resurrection. But the thing about that is a sign is that it's a fundamentally useless sign because it's an after the fact sign, right? They're looking for a sign, and the sign is going to be a future one. And given the entire approach, they're not going to appreciate that either. They're going to deny it. So it's all a useless sign. So the important thing, he says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. So they're evil and they're adulterous. Adultery is the greatest sin one can commit. It's the greatest
I thought
sin.
it was pride.
No,
It's not pride.
pride is sort of an individual sin. Adultery is a denial that God is God, or it's worshiping a false God, even more than simply a denial. So, it wipes God off the slate. That's much worse, than being prideful or, being arrogant or whatever. It's the ultimate sin. So, why are they adulterous? Does anyone, they follow the law. What makes them adulterous? They're good law observing Jews.
Because they're putting the law in place of God. They're changing, like they're taking the place of God and putting the law.
Right. They're placing the law above God. They're adding their own interpretations of the law that are contrary to God. We see Jesus talking about that. And fundamentally, what that all means is that they're misrepresenting God. So remember, the Israelites are God's people not because there's anything particularly special about them. It's because God has chosen them to be his messengers, to bring the knowledge of God to the world and to bring the nations to Mount Zion. Right? So,
And they had false teachings.
and so you can see, when Jesus later talks about the proselytes who are twice as much children of hell as their teachers, that's an indication of that. That's part of the indictment. They're misrepresenting God. They're conveying to the world an image of God that's false. So that's really very, very, very serious. They're idolatrous. They are worshiping a God that they've constructed that does not exist. And in the process, they're denying God's Messiah. And because of that, denying God as well. So then we have um, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. So we've had conflict over divorce. We've had some clashes. Um, but Jesus enters as the triumphant king, uh, even though it's the caricature of a king sitting either on two donkeys or sitting sideways on a donkey, depending on which gospel. But it's a caricature of a king's entry into Jerusalem because, in some sense, Jesus is an anti-king. He's not a worldly king who's concerned with power and the trappings of power and the trappings of wealth and good appearances. He's concerned with being the king of God's kingdom. And so he cleanses the temple, which is a prophetic statement that announces that the usefulness of the temple is at an end. He does that because temple has been turned into a commercial money making operation, because the court of the Gentiles has been used for the sale of animals, which in turn crowds out the Gentiles. And if the Gentiles aren't allowed in the temple, then are Gentiles to come to a knowledge of God? That becomes very unclear. And then we have a series of conflicts. We have a conflict with the chief priests and elders who ask by what authority he's doing this. And he manages, and then he has a conflict with the Sadducees, and then again with the Pharisees. And in each case, he manages to, best his opponents. With the Sadducees, he actually tries to appeal to them on their own grounds. So they're asking about the resurrection and they're making fun of the resurrection. And instead of using the prophetic works to prove the resurrection, he does it based on, what is it called? The law about marrying your deceased husband's widow. So it's a much more difficult argument to make. Yet he does it because they don't believe in the authority of the prophetic writings. The Sadducees only believe in the authority of the Mosaic law. And so, but none of that is of any consequence because they still reject Jesus. And so the result of that is our favorite section of Matthew's gospel, the woes. So we have the 7 woes. We can look at it as a bill of indictment. I won't read all 7 woes again. So we have the 7 woes are basically, we can see them as 7 counts of the indictment.
Where
So
do they start, Ron?
chapter 23,
Okay.
starting in verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither enter it yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. So that's an intrinsic, it's very clear why does that happen? Why would you not enter it? Because the God you're worshiping is not God, because you've constructed a God and you're going to go to hell because you're idolatrous. And because you're presenting this image of a false God, you're either repelling people or you're leading them to a false God. And then that's the second point, the second woe, that the converts are even worse than the original, more children of hell than their teachers. So 7 points of the indictment. And then we have the sentence in chapter 23, verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to you. So they murder God's messengers. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is forsaken and desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So it's a sentence. It's a sentence a sentence, it's a death sentence on Jerusalem. And some interpret, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, as hopeful, but it's really not hopeful. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is from which psalm? I don't remember the number of the psalm.
118.
Right, 118. Right,
Good.
so
I don't have
Pil-
that memorized. I had it written down.
thank you. Yeah, my notes have gotten rather disorganized. So it's a psalm that pilgrims recite as they're coming into the temple, and it also has messianic significance. But in this case, it's really a threat that's tied to the sentence. So you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's speaking to contemporary Jerusalem. He's speaking to the religious establishment and his opposition. And he's saying that there will be something that happens that will confirm that I am the Messiah, that I have come in the name of the Lord. And since it's part of his, death sentence, it's not going to be pleasant. So your house is forsaken, your house is desolate, and then that provides the key to the beginning of the Olivet Discourse. So I'll read and comment as we go along. Jesus left the temple, so that fundamentally, Jesus is fundamentally finished with temple Judaism. His departure is uh, continuing condemnation. He was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. He says it's going to be desolate. Not one stone will be, he's going to say, not one stone is left unturned. But it's ridiculous that the temple is going to be desolate, right? The temple is the center of Judaism. The temple is where God dwells. The temple is central to Judaism. The temple is this magnificent structure dedicated to God. What idiot would think that it's going to be desolate? That's ridiculous. That's totally absurd. Jesus, although everyone believes he's the Messiah, must have lost it, right? Then in verse 2, but he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly, and notice the truly, it's a divine pronouncement. I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The temple will be destroyed. So as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? Now, earlier he said, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, but he didn't use the word, the noun or the verb based on Perusha, which is the greeting given a king, and which has, in the Christian tradition, come to refer to the second coming. So, but the disciples ask, what will be the sign of your coming? And they do use Perusha. So it becomes a different question. They probably don't realize that they're asking a different question that's unrelated to blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But they are, and Jesus answers the question. So we have two questions. When will this be? When will there be uh, um, not one stone upon another that will not be thrown down? When will the temple be destroyed? Question one. And question two, what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? And Jesus answered them, take heed that no one leads you astray. That's kind of an ominous beginning that suggests that it's very easy for us to be led astray, as the voluminous and mostly horrible literature on the Olivet Discourse and on the Second Coming and suggests. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. So there are going to be false messiahs, and there are going to be, there are going to be false messiahs. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So wars and rumors of wars, and we discussed that there are always wars and rumors of war. So anyone who prophesies that something is going to happen when there are wars and rumors of war should be stoned right on the spot, because it's a false prophet, except in the one period in which there are not supposed to be wars and rumors of war, which is Pax Romana. So this is really a historically specific reference or a historically dated reference. It's not that, I'm going to come when I'll come after you hear about wars and rumors of war. It's an answer to the first question, and it's historically specific. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. So the beginning of the birth pangs. So there are some signs that point to the beginning of the birth pangs. And so what are birth pangs? He's likening it to a woman in labor, right? So what happens when the woman delivers?
You have something brand new.
Is it brand new?
The child is.
Well, no,
To us,
the child, inherits. Today we know that the child inherits, half of its DNA from its mother and half from its father. But also, that life is, created as a result of sexual union. And, so in Jesus' time, even without knowledge of DNA, there is a recognition that in some form a child is on the one hand, an individual personality that comes from a father and a mother. So it's not an entirely new thing. It's related to the previous thing. So our children are related to us. So that's an important. That's a uh, really important concept, because it means that there's going to be continuity as well as discontinuity. On the one hand, it's a brand new life, but it's not really brand new. It has features of the parents from which it came, or the parents from which he or she came. It's not an it. So, in some sense, fundamentally, that kind of concept of the birth pang is really expanded by St. Vincent of Lérins into the Christian understanding of history. that there's continuity and discontinuity. So that's important. Now, the second coming is not a continuity and a discontinuity. That's a complete transformation, and it's a complete transformation determined by God. No one knows the day or the hour. It comes upon us suddenly when we least expect it. There are no signs. So that's a really important sort of clue that this is not about the end times, not about the second coming. So this is the beginning of birth pangs or the sufferings. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. So there's going to be persecution from without. There will be false prophets and false messiahs. And there will be apostasy. When he's talking about most men's love will grow cold, he's talking about Christians. One of the things we often do in talking about the second coming is we look at the evil of society around us. You sort of often hear that society has become evil, and the problem is with that is that society is supposed to be evil. It's assumed to be evil. It doesn't know God. All of this stuff about evil doesn't apply to society. It applies to the church. And so that's one of the really dangerous things about looking for the second coming, because society is evil. There's all of this evil around us, is that we usually pronounce it in a spirit of self-righteousness, concealing our own evil, which often is greater than the evil of society around us. So, which in turn is a form of idolatry. So in any case, here, the Jesus is talking about the church, and he's talking about a falling away. He's talking about love of God growing cold. And then a message of hope, but he who endures to the end will be saved. Exactly the Catholic doctrine of salvation. He who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So we saw that's a very historically specific reference. First of all, we saw that the word used is oikumene and not cosmos. The gospel will be preached to the civilized world. The gospel will be preached within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. That's what oikumene means. That can only happen once, and it's already happened. We read about Paul. We saw that Paul believed that the gospel was preached throughout the civilized world, was preached throughout oikumene. And in the patristic tradition, the fathers believed that prophecy was also fulfilled before the destruction of the temple.
But now it's even more pronounced, right? I mean,
What do you mean?
reaching many more countries.
Yeah, but that's not part of the prophecy.
Okay.
That's not part of the prophecy. I mean, the goal is to bring all nations and all peoples to a knowledge of God, but Jesus' prophecy is about the gospel being spread throughout oikumene, one of the things we do is we lose them and forget about the meaning of words and substitute the words we like. And
Right,
you can't do that. It
right.
says oikumene, and that means oikumene. It means the civilized world, means the Roman Empire. It doesn't mean the world as a whole. That would be cosmos, and that's a different word.
Oh, okay.
So so this is a prophecy that has already been fulfilled
Mm,
in Paul's lifetime. Paul
mm,
believed it was fulfilled. So that prophecy can't be fulfilled twice because it's about
right.
oikumene, unless we the notion of a civilized world and an uncivilized world has, except for among our white supremacist brethren, has rather thankfully left us. So there can be, one would hope, no more fulfillment of the gospel preached to the civilized world. Hopefully, we've moved beyond that conception, but it's a conception that was universal, in both uh, the Roman Empire and among the Greeks. So that's a fulfilled prophecy that has no further fulfillment. So, so when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get a coat. And alas, for those who are with child and for those who are nursing those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. So when you see the abomination of desolation or the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel, so that's Antiochus with his idol in the holy place. That was seen as a one time fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy uh, in Judaism. But um, we still are going to, we'll divert to studying Daniel and his eschatological timetable after we finish the Olivet Discourse. But that happened for um, 3 years. The prophecy calls for a desolation that lasts for 3.5. And Antiochus's, that is, lasted 3 years. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 3.5 years in fulfilling Daniel's prophecy. And so notice Jesus has these general signs, gospel preached through the world, wars and rumors of war, the sort of global or, you know, general Roman Empire wide conditions. And then it narrows right here. Let those who are in Judea, people in Italy don't need to worry about fleeing. Uh, people in Syria don't need to worry about fleeing. People in Greece don't need to worry about fleeing. It's people in Judea. They need to flee. And it's urgent once you see. And what is the desolating sacrilege and the abomination of desolation? It's the Roman army with their uh, banner, which is an eagle, which is an unclean bird. So that desolation is going to occupy the holy place. It's going to be responsible for not one stone being left unturned. They're marching to the banner of a dirty bird, an unclean bird, that they also, individual legions also worship. So it's both unclean and idolatrous. So it's a huge sacrilege. Alas, for those with child, very difficult to flee quickly when you're with child. And for those who are nursing, besides the fact that you're bearing the baby and that slows you down. Oh, and for those with child, there's also, as Theophylact points out, the problem that your child may be eaten if you stay. Pray that your flight be not be in winter, obviously difficult to travel in winter, or on a Sabbath. The gates are locked. You'll be stuck. If you need to get out, you won't be able to. So, desperate need of immediate flight. So, why is he given this warning? Does anyone have any idea?
So when it comes to pass, they will know he was the Messiah.
Why do they need to know? Why not also give all of the signs for the second coming in verse 36?
Hmm. Because they won't
So,
know for sure until these things start happening. But to lend credence to what he's said all along.
Well, think of the historical situation. He's talking about false messiahs, he's talking about persecution, he's talking about apostasy, he's talking about the love of many will go cold. So, on the one hand, the gospel is preached throughout the civilized world, but on the other hand, there's a falling away. And on the other hand, the church is small still. The church is very small. The church is centered in Jerusalem. And because it's centered in Jerusalem, because it's a period of apostasy, because the church is small, there's a possibility that the church can be destroyed.
So
And
by
and
giving
even
these
if
warnings, the Christians will get out. As other
exactly,
things start happening, the Christians will
exactly,
leave.
that's the point. Jerusalem is the center of the faith still. That changes, and it remains very important. We can we have Saint Cyril of Jerusalem's work, but the church is small. Its spiritual center is Jerusalem, and in some ways, Jerusalem is also the unifying center of the church. So, if Jerusalem goes and the Christians are in Jerusalem, the faith, Christianity may be destroyed.
And then during the time of Paul, there was Nero that was
Right.
burning Christians alive, and
Right. That was the tribulation that he mentioned earlier.
yeah.
Right. So so there's a possibility that the church can be destroyed. And
Yeah.
so it's important that the church in Jerusalem and in Judea recognize the signs so that they can flee. And so Jesus really emphasizes that importance of flight and emphasizes the signs. We went over the eight signs, remember. Those are important, and those are all historically specific. They're not, these are all signs about when Jesus is coming again, that all signs that the destruction of the temple is going to happen. You can begin to look, you begin to prepare. Then once the Roman armies are anywhere in the neighborhood, you know that this is going to end badly. And we remember we also discussed the flee. The historically the tendency has been to go to Jerusalem, which is a walled city, in cases of turmoil and trouble. It's the safest place. If things hit the fan, you want to be in Jerusalem as opposed to out in Judea somewhere. So Jesus is telling everyone to do something that's counterintuitive, flee. And we know from the writings of the fathers that when the temple fell, there were no Christians in Jerusalem. They had recognized the signs and that they had fled to Pella predominantly. So that's really very significant. Without that, we would probably not be Christians today. And so, many of us have completely misinterpreted that and made this all about the second coming. And none of it is about the second coming. It's all historically specific. It's all about the destruction of the temple. And for us, it's also about hope that he who or she who persists to the end will be saved. We will be saved. Whether the faith of many grows cold, whether there's apostasy, we individually don't have to allow our faith to grow cold. We don't have to accept apostasy. So we'll start them right after the abomination of desolation. I think that this is really very, very, very important. It profoundly disturbs me to see, sort of all of this sort of teaching, the first part of the Olivet Discourse used to, talk about the second coming when that's so patently not what it's about. And this focus on the second coming is just not good. I mean, when we get to it, no one knows the day and the hour. And there's a reason for that no one knows the day of the hour. The church is now large. Regardless of the level of persecution, the church cannot be destroyed. And we don't need to know the day or the hour, because then we're going to begin trying to prepare ourselves for the day and the hour when we're not prepared. Otherwise, we can be lax until the hour comes. And then when we do that, that becomes about us. It becomes important that I be saved. But, and I know many will disagree, but it's not important that I be saved. That's just not, at the top of God's agenda or anyone else's. It's important that we as a community of God represent Christ and that we as a community of God be saved.